Well, welcome everybody. I'd like to get things kicked off. It's currently 12:30, so we're going to go ahead and start the brown bag today. I'm Dr. Steve Fleming. I'm one of the professors at University of Southern California Spatial Sciences Institute. And today we're going to have the first of a number of brown bags that are going to be provided by Spatial Sciences Institute over the course of the spring semester. And so today's topic is using reality modeling to rapidly generate terrain data sets. Slide. So these are the folks going to be presenting today. I'm going to do a few quick introductions, and I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman on the far right, Kyle McCullough, as well. Dr. Jason Knowles, who's affiliated faculty with Spatial Sciences Institute, will be providing some of his insights on this particular topic. And then I'll close it out with some discussion about how we can then bring some of this into the classroom and how we can prepare students for the work of some of this reality modeling that we're trying to undertake. So again, I'm going to kick it over to Kyle McCullough. He is one of the great folks over at Institute for Creative Technologies that helps us build some of these very interesting data sets. The connection between Spatial Sciences Institute at University of Southern California, one of the academic units, and then one of the large lab facilities at University of Southern California, which is the Institute for Creative Technologies, came to bear a number of years ago. As an old Army guy, I worked with the gentleman who currently runs the Institute for Creative Technologies, and we were discussing ways that academic units could be clearly involved with some of the work that's being done in his organization. And as a function of that, we brought together a number of researchers and educators together to do some of the work that's currently being done at ICT. Slide. So Kyle, I'm going to kick it to you. You can talk a little bit about what ICT is and then where it fits in the research infrastructure at USC. Kyle McCullough.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. All right. I'm Kyle McCullough, the Director of Modeling and Simulation at ICT, the Institute for Creative Technologies. ICT is a UARC, a university-affiliated research center, so we're a Department of Defense-sponsored organization. We develop lots of immersive experiences, advanced prototypes, using groundbreaking research and trying to both support defense initiatives while also, exploring technology to advance basic and applied research, benefiting learning, education, health, human performance, and knowledge. The modeling and simulation team, especially, we are spearheading a number of one world terrain initiatives. So obviously, when it comes to reality modeling, the Army is very interested in building a global geospatial capability. And we're one of the lead science and technology research supporters for the Army's One World Terrain program. So little bit about the One World Terrain program. The idea is to provide warfighters at the point of need with a 3D global terrain capability. So give them all of the tools they need to sort of organically collect terrain wherever they might be in the world, be able to use existing terrain data sources, and have that terrain be able to replicate the coverage and the complexity of that operational environment, making sure that that data is current and up to date, making sure that it's accurate, making sure that it can support training, operations, simulation, and mission command systems. The way that we sort of look at the One World Terrain research is across this 5-step process. So we look at it very holistically, where the first phase is collection, the second step processing, third storage, distribution, and then application. And so the idea being that by looking at the terrain pipeline holistically, taking it all the way from the source data, whether that be flying a drone or pulling data from existing GIS or satellite sources, all the way to the application phase where we're actually using that data in a runtime environment or using tools for analysis on that data. Any of those steps can have significant effect on the other areas of that pipeline. So by not sort of stovepiping that development and ensuring that we're sort of looking at this program holistically has allowed us to really advance in a number of ways. And so looking across this, I know there's a lot going on with this slide, but sort of the basic idea here. Oh, there we go. Can you hear me now? All right, great. We've been working on this program since 2016. And initially the sort of idea behind the program was fly a drone, collect the data, do a photogrammetric reconstruction, and then just visualize that data. And so if you look at the top of this one, the automation, the accuracy, and the interoperability are keys of optimizing and advancing those across the 5-step pipeline. So if you kind of bring it across to where we're at today, it's no longer just to flying a drone and a drone collection. That's still a big part of the program, especially for high resolution insets. But we now support all manner of 2D and 3D file formats as the sort of input into the pipeline. Going into that pipeline, being processed, creating rich feature attributed simulation ready data. All of that is part of an automated process using machine learning and artificial intelligence to output that rich simulation ready data. Storing that data no longer just occurs on a single file system where you've got to copy something to a hard drive and ship it to whoever needs it. Although, to be honest, it can still be part of the program as well, but using secure cloud-based infrastructures, making sure that we have those methods in place to both store the data securely and effectively, distribute the data securely and effectively, as well as tracking that data and using existing software and commercial platforms like Esri's ArcGIS to make sure that we have a really great grasp of those holdings and all of the metadata associated with the terrain collections. So I think one of the things that's really great, thinking especially on the GIS side and how this applies, is that over time, the definition of what a map is has really changed. So, if you take it all the way back, you've got your cartographer who's doing a 2D hand-drawn paper map, where they're getting that information from sort of just like their own senses, walking around the earth, taking measurements, building these 2D maps. That obviously advanced into the stages where you can use additional sources to build out 2D computer-generated images, black and white, printing them out. That then, you add color, you get a whole new layer of richness and analysis to that map. Now suddenly you're able to store that map on the web and access it from anywhere, or carry it around on a mobile device, and it no longer is reliant on this printed paper. Then you're moving into the idea of using this 3D content. So now your map is actually rich with the static 3D content where you can actually navigate around on a flat screen. And where we're getting at today, where maps are no longer 2D, they're no longer 3D, maps become this 4D immersive experience. So you can have multiple users utilizing one map at one time. You've got an enhanced user experience. The map can take into account physics, real-time analytics, time. These things are all what we think of now, where we look at the idea of map and how we're actually using that rich geospatial information and how we can actually collate all of that information into a singular data source at once. Looking again, and I alluded to this previously, but the 5-step pipeline. So going into collection, when we're looking at collection, we're breaking it down into sort of some key areas: satellite, aerial, drone, ground, existing imagery, maps, elevation data, and programs of record data. So, again, the key here is that there's not a single source. It's very source open and agnostic for how we're actually bringing information into the One World Terrain program, how we're actually building all of this data into simulation ready data. A lot of data fusion occurs at the processing phase, where perhaps we're able to get a really high level of geospatial accuracy from satellite imagery. However, we're able to get a much higher visual resolution from drone-based collection or ground-based collection, whereas the GPS that was doing that collection might not be as accurate. So by fusing that information, using the accuracy from the satellite data, the visual accuracy from the photogrammetric reconstruction of drone data, we actually wind up with a much more visually high fidelity visual product, as well as a highly accurate geospatial product. So just the idea that any one of these sources has its pros and cons. There's limitations with everything, but as you start to fuse all of these things and sort of pull the best of class information from these sources, you actually can wind up with something that's really going to be very valuable as you start to push it through the pipeline. The processing phase. So this is where a lot of really interesting things happen. And we've built out a custom pipeline using machine learning data models to analyze these data sets, as well as do some post-processing and cleanup of the meshes. But the idea is to take all of that source imagery, push that into this processing phase. At the processing phase, we can start to build those mesh models, build point clouds, use derivative information to begin to break the terrain data apart. So we can identify buildings, ground, vegetation. We can start to break up those individual pieces as well. So we get ground materials, surface materials, building materials. We can understand the vegetation, what this vegetation actually comprised of, make estimates based on the geospatial location as to what species of tree this might be that we're actually seeing in the point cloud data. And again, all of this happening through an automated process. We can then do things like road classification, where we can use the imagery and the point cloud data with the textures to understand where roads might be, as well as using additional sources like OpenStreetMaps to add some additional inference on that road information for a higher accuracy of road classification. We can do the same thing using Bing imagery. So we can use Bing imagery as well as Bing 3D surface models to do this segmentation and classification. And ultimately, we can take all of that information and output a optimal runtime formats that can go into standard game engines, go into mission command systems, go into 3D and analytical software and other GeoAnt applications. And all of that data packaged up into a well-formed format. So, you're not just getting sort of a dump of all of this data, defining what a building is made of and where the doors and windows are and what is the ground outside of that building. You're getting a very concise, well-formed data model that's easy to analyze and make sense of, so that as you're working with this rich 3D mesh data, beautiful textures, wonderful geometry, underlying that and feeding it is all of the metadata and attribution information to actually make it very useful to analytics and simulation systems. A little bit more about that process is it's a piece of software called Staples Plus, developed in-house at ICT. It's the Semantic Terrain Points Labeling System Plus. If you look at the images on the top here, on the right side of the slide, the top left image is what a human sees. We see this and we make a lot of sense of it. We see buildings, we see a fence, we see the ground. We know that's probably dry grass. We see roads. When the computer looks at this, it sees triangles, polygons, and texture meshes. It doesn't really know much about it. And then the image here with the blue, the red, and the green is what we want the computer to be able to see. So we want the computer to be able to make sense of this data the same way that we do. So the computer's seeing the buildings and the ground and the trees and vegetation all separated. Part of how we're doing this, again, is we're analyzing that point cloud, but we're also looking at the reconstructed mesh as well as the source photography. So the images that you see here on the bottom right, when we originally built the Staples Plus system, it was only doing point cloud analytics. When you're doing a point cloud analysis, you're not really getting the resolution that you might need for fine features. So what you see here is the point cloud representation of a window. Just below that is the source photography representation of a window. So when you're doing a 2D analysis, it's much easier to determine that that's a window than it is in the point cloud itself. So we've developed a process within Staples of doing that 2D analysis, taking the 2D information, as 2D image recognition is a very mature process, and then back projecting that information into the 3D mesh model. So getting those window and door locations, vehicle identification, light posts, those type of things are very easy to pull from the 2D source imagery. And by knowing the camera position when that 2D imagery was captured, using that pose to make an estimation for projecting that back into the 3D point cloud, we're able to now have this very richly attributed 3D data using both the 2D and the 3D recognition processes. Going in a little bit on the storage side. So storage and distribution of this data is a major challenge, especially when you're talking about creating this high resolution 3D data for the entire globe. Storage size is a problem. Talking about how do you secure and distribute this information, a whole slew of additional issues. But there are existing systems today that we've been working to integrate with that make a lot of those things easier. So, perfect example, Amazon Web Services using S3 for a lot of the data that we have that's government sensitive. Amazon Web Services offers a Gov Cloud. So being able to have a AWS Gov Cloud that can synchronize directly with a program like GRID, which is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's large data repository for geospatial holdings, as well as using commercial products like ArcGIS. Again, to be able to store this data, have a really quick method for understanding this data and knowing what's accessible. And what we're currently working towards on the storage and distribution side is direct integration with Maxar and the Vricon, who's the vendor for the One World Terrain program, to make sure that we can kind of synchronize all of these things and have this API-driven process that makes this really easy to both access, analyze, and deliver the data, especially when you're looking at the defense side and potentially looking at using the data in areas where natural disasters may have occurred. The sort of pipeline links that are going to take the network from this cloud stored data to where it needs to actually be used at the point of need are probably going to be fairly limited, and in some cases even completely cut off. So trying to overcome a lot of those hurdles is really one of the major challenges of the program. And so, this being all sort of the data side, the other side of this is building out tools that are going to make use of this data. So we've sort of come up with this idea of a research-oriented feedback loop. So we have a piece of software called RIDE. It's the Rapid Integration and Development Environment, which I'll get into in just a little bit as well. But one of the keys here is, all right, we've got all this great data. How do we know that this data is actually working the way we want it to? How do we know that this rich feature attribution is making a difference? What might need to be fine-tuned? Those type of things. And so we've built this feedback loop where, using the One World Terrain data, the One World Terrain pipeline, we can take the output, drop that into a scenario that we've built out in RIDE that, for instance, might use some type of cover and concealment that's reliant on material attribution for autonomous entities to be able to make decisions within a synthetic environment. And then we can get the output from that. So we can get some very precise metrics based on the behavior of those autonomous agents within that environment using the data. So build a bunch of useful tools that can sort of make use of the data. We now have tools that are useful and beneficial, but also provide direct output as metrics that we can plug back into the beginning of the pipeline. So if perhaps we determine that some features are more useful than others when we're doing material classification, we can refocus the efforts on how we're actually beginning to understand those features at the data side in the One World Terrain pipeline and run that back through, and then get new metrics out and understand and validate the use cases to make sure that we're actually doing a good job when we're pulling that data together. Some examples of those tools and how we're sort of analyzing those metrics and how they can be used for validation is the Army has and the Department of Defense in general has a need for battle damage assessment. So being able to take a 3D terrain data set, as if a battle were have happened, as if ordnance were have been exploded, depending on the scenario, what may have happened to this terrain and how has it changed over time with dynamic destruction, dynamic deformation, and this again, all being informed by the data model. So we can actually start to make direct metrics to understand how well that's working, how well it's mirroring reality, how well the sort of digital twin idea is being replicated within the simulation environment to what might actually be happening in the real world, as there's a lot of data to support both sides. Something like battle damage assessment is a foundational tool. So building out those the dynamic destructibility and deformation become these foundational components that build that tool. Just because that tool is great for military use to understand, the actual post effects of the battle, those same exact foundational tools can be used to do post-disaster assessment. So, being able to sort of take these tools abstractly and reapply them to different ideas. For instance, in this case, emergency services after an earthquake, is a big part of where we want to push the program and how we want to make the program more accessible, especially taking it outside of the defense-oriented goals. A little more of a look into that, the realistic runtime modifications of that deformation and destructibility. So again, this is a fully automated tool set that we've built out that takes that material classification information. So you can see, for instance, a building is shattering as if it were concrete in this case, whereas the ground is deforming. And so, typically a lot of these type of real-time modifications rely on artist created damage states or sort of pre-calculating information to achieve these. And when you're looking again at something at global scale, and especially when you're looking at something that you need to be able to run simulation at global scale on a large amount of this high resolution data, there's not time for an artist. You might not be able to get an expert in there to sort of do these recreated damage states or pre-compute the information. So we've got this process of doing it all at runtime to achieve something that we can continue to iterate on to bring it to a higher fidelity. And an example of this sort of in progress here and in process is doing a minimum safe distance. So being able to understand ordnance, how that's going to actually have a blast area, what the safe distance standoff is from that blast area, as well as looking at what the actual damage effects are from that destructibility. So here's a video actually showing some of this in use. So being able to sort of design ordnance based off of typical explosives and how they might actually be put together in an operational environment or in a disaster response environment, for instance, in defensibility, and then actually being able to replicate some of that destructibility effect on a terrain at runtime. Again, in this use case that you're seeing the video of, this is, sort of specifically geared towards the Army's battle damage assessment based on typical military weapons and munitions. But again, abstracting these foundational ideas and looking at how this could be used, for instance, in understanding how to secure a facility against a terrorist attack, or how to be able to understand the post-effect of natural disasters. It's all the same foundational tool sets where they've been built for a military use. They can be abstracted and used for any number of use cases. Another really good example of this is what we've put together for these infantry battle drills. So there are very specific infantry battle drills that follow very specific doctrine. But if you think of the foundational capabilities that are being put together here, you have autonomous agents who have an awareness of their 3D simulation. They have an awareness of the material classification, the ground they're walking on, other agents within the space, and they're responding in certain ways based on doctrine and proper response to behaviors that they're encountering. So, again, if you sort of abstract some of these foundational tools and you think of how this could be applied to the Department of Homeland Security or to response for active shooter drills, again, these agents are using line of sight, they're using terrain knowledge, terrain reasoning, the 3D geometry. If you look at building up defensibility for large scale events like the Super Bowl, we recently did a collect, and I believe Jason is going to touch on this shortly, but for SoFi Stadium and how the Department of Homeland Security can use a 3D mesh model with all of that terrain-rich attribution and terrain reasoning information to begin to secure, a site as large as SoFi Stadium for events like the Super Bowl or the Olympics. And so, one thing I really want to get across is that, we've got this pipeline for creating the rich data, and we can give you the tools and show you how to create rich data and get you access to rich data. And we've built a bunch of the tools that can reason with that data and do some of these interesting things that actually provide the analysis. But the one thing we can't give is the creativity. So if you sort of bring creativity to this data and these tools, there's an infinite number of possibilities of how these things can sort of be tied together and what can actually come out of them. Just that simple example of using battle damage assessment to actually do natural disaster reasoning and understand how response after a natural disaster could better occur is a perfect example. And so there's lots of ways to tie the foundational data and the foundational capabilities together to actually start to build some of these things up in really unique ways. And I'll show here a example from the RIDE platform, which again is that rapid integration and development environment, which I think gives a really good idea sort of how some of these things can be tied together in unique ways. Currently, how they're being used by the Army, but how these capabilities can be used in other ways that take it outside of the defense-oriented space. And we're currently actually working to get the RIDE platform and all of these foundational tools I've been describing to be able to share much more openly. For USC students, this is something that we can typically share even today. We can easily share this with any government organizations as well, but we're even looking to push that to get it to being able to share it with other academia and industry collaborators as well.
The USC Institute for Creative Technologies used Unity to create the Flexible Simulation Prototyping Sandbox, known as RIDE, or Rapid Integration and Development Environment. By uniting multiple lines of research and a suite of capabilities in a single codebase, RIDE provides a development platform that will directly benefit the Army's synthetic training environment, as well as the larger DoD simulation community. Here, we see how a soldier can use the capabilities imported from One World Terrain to plan a mission in the National Training Center's Razish training area. The dimensions and measurements match the real world, and this analysis simulates potential enemy units' line of sight, showing how they could endanger the patrol. By adjusting the route, the small unit leader can minimize risk. A simulated mission is in progress using network multiplayer functionality. The fire team can communicate to change their formation, respond to threats, and more. This reconstruction has gone through a One World Terrain automated feature attribution pipeline to make it interactive and destructible. Additionally, USC ICT has built a machine learning platform into RIDE and has conducted multiple AI experiments. As researchers and developers create new capabilities, these capabilities are added to the API for other performers to use, optimize, and iterate upon. RIDE was created in Unity through the Training Software and Management Tools effort, or TSMT. RIDE is accessible across the DoD, requires very little training, and is designed to be modified with ease. It's coded to enable straightforward ports to additional runtimes, and complex capabilities can be shared easily. This accessibility distinguishes RIDE from proprietary platforms, and is already in use by STE developers, the Office of Naval Research, Lockheed Martin, and Dignitas Technologies. Learn more about RIDE or download the API here.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason Knowles to take us through sort of the operational use and some of the actual data that's currently being used outside of the defense industry.
Hey, thanks, Kyle. Appreciate that. Great job. I'm Jason Knowles. I'm the CEO and founder of GeoAcuity. We're a small geospatial consulting firm. I'm also adjunct faculty here at Spatial Sciences Institute. I was first introduced to ICT in the One World Terrain program about 3 years ago. And when I first saw their data, my immediate thought was, wow, this is an incredibly realistic, accurate data set, high resolution for these modeling and simulation applications. So as a geographer, I wanted to see, can we use these in other applications outside of modeling and simulation? So what we wanted to do modeling in sim typically resides in a 0, 0 coordinate space. They're a single scene. They don't typically interact with other data sets. And that's okay, but we wanted them to be more like traditional GIS data and interact in the real world place and space. So we wanted to transition these data sets from a modeling and simulation specific need to a more interoperable data set that could support more 3D visualization and mission planning software. So, and then can we operationalize it? So that was a two-step process. The first step was to enable the geospatial coordinates that were resident within the imagery. That would enable us to drop it in the right place in space. The second piece of that was to neck down the geospatial coordinates. The coordinate systems, or sorry, the GPS receivers on a lot of these commercial off-the-shelf UAS systems are not very good. So we were able to go in and find RTK, PPK, survey grade GNSS to allow us to get that data set into a tighter formation. In addition to doing that, we wanted to find common data formats that work for both communities, both modeling and sim and the GeoInt community. And that was things like the Esri's i3S, 3D tiles, and OBJ. Once we enabled the geospatial coordinates on these data sets, we're able to successfully integrate that into the Army Command Post, CPCE, and JCR software applications, as well as the Android Tactical Assault Kit. And that's what you see in the upper right there. That's not a picture, that's a real world model of San Clemente Island within the ATAC infrastructure. The data sets, once they were geospatially enabled, were also able to be brought into other geospatially environmental socket sets, the Esri suite, quick terrain modeler, etc. And as Kyle talked about, once we started getting these things in the real world environment and in operational software, we started to get mission support application requests from the end user. So a lot of the guys on the ground wanted to know, can we have a minimum safe distance tool? Can we have a breaching tool assigned with that? Kyle also stole my thunder a little bit on the SOFI data set. We don't only work with DoD, we also work with other USG entities. The Department of Homeland Security, for instance, contracted us out to fly SoFi Stadium for the security of next year's Super Bowl. So we flew it, and we're in the process of building out a 3D model that will be ingested into some of the systems that you saw there with Kyle. Next slide, please. I think you have to advance to get the, perfect, thank you. So can we have some impact of this data, or what is the impact of this data outside of the DoD and the US government? There are differences that exist between the two workflows for USG and the private sector. A lot of those revolve around requirements around cyber mitigation, et cetera. Can you use foreign-based platforms or foreign-built platforms and things like that? However, there are many transferable lessons that we learn excuse me, across the modeling that are applicable for the commercial sector and across many of the different verticals. First and foremost, if you want to advance one more slide, Kyle, the data is a force multiplier here. So one UAS flight gives us a whole suite of both 3D and 2D data. We get imagery, we get a point cloud, we get a digital elevation model, contours, and a 3D mesh. So the applicability is large off of one collect. Next slide, please. And I'll also, outside of DoD, let's think about environmental applications, for instance. This reconstruction here is a reconstruction we built for the Catalina Island Conservancy. We flew this area of Middle Ranch. We were doing a study on bison migration through Middle Ranch for them. Again, like they spoke to in the video, these models are all real world measurements and accurate in both size and scale. Other environmental applications can include precision agriculture, vegetation mapping, especially for using multispectral sensors, and mapping of site surveys. Next slide, please. So there's municipal applications as well. What you're looking at here is a 3D model of the West Basin Municipal Water District. This is, again, it's not a picture, this is a 3D model. I think it speaks to the sophistication of the photogrammetry software. When you're looking at something as complex as this, you'll notice there's a lot of rails, a lot of stairways and ladders and pipes, and they're all very clean and very well built on the in the 3D model from an overhead capture from a UAS. If you look at a type of model like this, not only is it a great 3D model, but we were talking to West Basin about potentially flying a thermal capture over the top of this. What that thermal capture can do is then apply heat signatures to your 3D model here. So where you see an influx in heat along one of the pipes is often an indicator that that pipe is getting thin at that area. So there's some real world applications for these 3D modelings and techniques that ICT is doing. Next slide. Of course, industrial mining is a huge user of drones at the moment. We're seeing a lot of work on doing volumetric calculations, looking how much of a certain agate or aggregate has been moved or extracted or built, how much has been taken off of the site. These are also used as quality control measures to check moving companies, where they invoice you for moving, say, 6 tons of dirt, and you've flown your drone over your spoil pile and you see they've only moved 4. So that's a big money saver there. Next slide. There's academic research. Kyle's gone into all the great stuff they're doing over at ICT. Certainly on the Staples Plus side, these segmentation and classification are huge. We did have the opportunity to collaborate with ICT on the thermal mapping of USC's campus, where we flew, as you can see here, we flew a fixed wing with a thermal sensor capturing the entire campus. And similar to what we talked about with West Basin, this thermal signature can be draped over the 3D model that we have of USC's campus. And we can look at things like energy efficiency of buildings. Are they leaking heat in the winter? Are they leaking cold in the summer? So these are some academic applications. And then emergency response. Kyle touched on some of the use cases of that. Certainly for us this year, we responded to 4 Northern California fires this year, where we used a lot of the techniques and capabilities that Kyle talked to. And we were able to get the first responders on the ground. There's some very, very current and very accurate and very high resolution damage imagery up to within 12 hours of launching the drone. And I think that moves us over to Steve's portion. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, so I would finish this up by asking the question to the audience, especially those that are in the seat of a student, is how do you prepare yourself to do some of the work that Kyle's talked about, as well as what Jason's talked about? And so as a jumping off point, who's going to be the next gen that's going to work on the issues of SoFi Stadium as we prepare for the Olympics? Not only the ones that are coming to Los Angeles, but what about the Olympics that are going to occur 10 years from now? Who's going to be doing that work, and how do you prepare yourself to do that type of work? Slide. So when we look at building academic programs, one of the big things that we do is we look at what that body of knowledge is. So it's the essential body of knowledge, and most all of the folks in spatial sciences recognize that there's different metrics that we use to do this. But in the human security geospatial intelligence world, which is kind of the cornerstone of this discussion today, there are a number of documents that assist us in doing that. So we leverage those to help us understand what's that body of knowledge that needs to be brought into the classroom. Next slide. And then from that, we ask the question, what kinds of academic programs should we be building? And so what you probably picked up on from the discussion earlier and listening to what Kyle was talking about, and as well as what Jason was talking about, is that the approach has to be multidisciplinary. You're not going to get all the information that you need just through one academic discipline. So in the modeling, simulation, and gaming discipline, really there's a number of disciplines that are going to contribute to the collective knowledge that's necessary in order to be effective in a growing field like this. And so these would likely include some of those that are listed here on this slide, whether you're talking, approaching the problem from computer science, or possibly software or app design, modeling and simulation studies. You can read the list, and certainly spatial sciences is part of that list when you're looking to work with data that's geo-specific, not geotypical. One of the mentions earlier by Kyle was this discussion of the data that looked like, felt like, smelled like real world data, but in fact, it was only inside of a gaming engine. It had some origin of a coordinate inside of a gaming engine of 0, 0, 0, and then everything else worked off of that. That would be geotypical data, but geospecific data recognizes that that same data, if collected properly, can be ingested into a gaming engine, and now that data becomes real. So a great example is for those gamers that are out there, show me the toggle button currently on whatever the device is that you're holding in your hand. Show me that toggle button that allows you to toggle on or toggle off the real world data coordinate of where you actually are inside the game engine. And I believe the answer today is that that toggle button doesn't exist. The goal would be to have that toggle button and actually be able to interact with a real coordinate inside the gaming engine of real world data. This obviously, begs the question, how are we doing the mapping of things that are inside buildings? And so interior mapping is one of those on the horizon or over the horizon technologies that is rapidly being advanced and rapidly being looked at on how we're going to ingest that type of data into these gaming engines. But in the end, no one program is going to answer the mail. So you're going to have collaborative academic programs in order to be able to prepare yourself for work in this field. Next slide. So this idea of no complacency, there's a great line out there that says complacency is one of the roots of failure. And so you can't be complacent in these academic disciplines that are changing rapidly. And so in the education space, understanding how we're learning, so as evidenced by what's been going on over the last year with how we actually take in content and take in knowledge is one of those things we have to address. The content that we're learning, what we learn is important, and then how we blend those together, specifically the tools that Kyle has mentioned and Jason has mentioned, some of the tools that are available for us to use in the software space are necessary to be able to continue to address those as things change. And then certainly recognizing the new applications, the what ifs. What if we had certain tools, could we do certain things? And being able to address those on the horizon and over the horizon technologies and techniques that are going to be used in the future. So these are critical in how we build academic programs moving forward so students are prepared for the work that they're going to be asked to do upon completion of academic programs. Next slide. So at the Spatial Sciences Institute, as with many other academic institutions, I don't think we're unique in this, but we're certainly, I think, forward thinking in this. And in the human security and geospatial intelligence world, these are some of the things that have been accomplished at Spatial Sciences Institute under the direction and leadership of Dr. John Wilson. And so when you look at this, since 2015, there's a number of academic programs that have been added to the list of things that students can do. So what you see when you look at this is you need to provide different points of entry for students, whether it be at the undergraduate level as a minor or an academic major for an undergraduate, all the way through those graduate studies, so that they could take and pick up on the requirements of education in order to be prepared for these types of challenges in the modeling, simulation, and gaming industry. Slide. So what you see on these next two slides are some of the templates that we've provided in building these kind of academic programs. So I'm not going to go through all the details of this slide, but what you would see if you looked at it in detail is that the approach is to look at the educational experience multidisciplinary. Outside of the general education, what you see is multiple academic programs are required in order to educate that future student, in this case, in a Bachelor of Science degree in human security and geospatial intelligence. The other thing you recognize in this is there's a number of electives and elective positions that allow the students to pick and choose which things they're going to need outside of the curriculum that's already designed for the student, which is multidisciplinary. Next slide. This is also true of advanced courses and advanced degrees. And so this is the Graduate Human Security Geospatial Education program. And what you see here are a number of different places within the essential courses, the advanced courses, and the capstone courses that provide opportunities for students to look at the problem from many different angles and to have the education underpinnings necessary in order to do the work that we've articulated earlier in the presentation. Next slide. So finally, I'll close with this, and this should hopefully lead us to the Q&A in a good way, and that's the research ideas and callouts. These are some things that are currently being published in some white papers that are going out right now about what the requirements are going to be for those future researchers, those that are in education, whether they be undergraduate students working on projects, whether they be graduate students working on, say, a thesis or possibly an advanced project with one of these organizations. But these are the kinds of research questions and research challenges that are out in front of us. And so again, these just are two of many, I would say, about things that need to be done as we approach this world of modeling, simulation, and gaming. But certainly there's many more for us to consider. Next slide. quick disclaimer from Institute for Creative Technologies, and now we'll move to Q&A. So again, we appreciate everyone's attendance today. We've left ourselves about 15 minutes for Q&A. We'll open it up for anyone that may have questions. If you have a question, please unmute your mic, ask the question, and then we'll try to provide the proper response. Thanks for your attendance.
Hi, my name is Crystal Salmon, and I'm part of the master's HSGI program. As far as the storage, you guys are talking about like a global cloud or government cloud, but in the battlefield, you may not have that accessibility. So are you guys preparing for local servers and databases and able to update for battle damage assessments? And how do you get that from the local servers to the global cloud?
That's a great question. I'll take that one. So still a lot of gaps in the solution that have yet to be figured out, but there's a few pieces that are sort of aimed towards trying to solve that, especially in a fully disconnected environment. So part of that is that there will be a version of the full global data at a much lower resolution than the high resolution 3D insets that will sort of be the supplemental version that, you know, will fit on a small SD card that is going to go with someone anywhere they're at in the globe. If they sort of have knowledge of their deployed area, they can then take kind of an extension of that gives them the most current version of the data as they're actually getting to the deployed location. Then part of the sort of future idea of the platform and how it would work is that there would be edge-based processing and storage that would allow the operator to then collect brand new data, flying a drone, using fully automated processes that would just update the changes from the data that they brought with them. So they don't actually need to wait for a full-scale reconstruction of the area. It's only going to make modifications to the existing data. That's one piece of it. Another piece is that there will sort of always be some type of cloud-based link. The transmission will be fully optimized using mesh optimization, using compression, lots of different methods of actually passing it back across the line, so that if there's even a small link, then there can be a trickle in a two-way communication between the edge and the sort of centralized cloud to pass necessary information back and forth. So so processing will occur at the edge that will determine what's critical to get back to the cloud, and processing will occur on the cloud to determine what might be critical to try to push to the edge. But, you know, as I mentioned, especially if you're looking at, you know, certain deployed areas or areas where a large-scale natural disaster has occurred, the infrastructure for any level of communication might not exist once the operation is actually kicked off. And so in that case, it's really going to be reliant on having that sort of point of need processing infrastructure set up. So, you know, the idea being that, you know, an operator, a first responder, some unit is going to have everything they need in a, you know, a compact hardware software footprint that fully automates that process and gives them that valid ultra current data as quickly as possible.
I also had one more question. In all this analysis, when you're doing battle damage assessment or also when you're doing natural damage assessment, are you guys taking into account, or is there a way to take into account human casualties as well?
So there absolutely is. We haven't gotten into that. It hasn't been one of our research requirements. But again, the part of what we're trying to do with this is develop those foundational capabilities that would support that as like an extensible piece of the research. So basically build up a bunch of these things that make that foundation easy, and then someone could build sort of like, you know, for lack of a better word, like a module that does the human accountability as well for that. Because the current software platform isn't too far off from having that be an option. So it's not something that we've built yet, but that's a great idea on that thought of like bringing the creativity to the tools and the data and what else can be done, because that it's one step away from achieving that as is. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Ives. I'm part of the Masters of HSGI. And I don't know if I missed it, but I was curious how close you are to creating a full low-res, like global data set that could be ready to go on the SD card. Is that something that's already existent, or is that something we're still working on?
So the answer is kind of both. A version of it does kind of exist today. It's the optimizations that like bring it within a sort of baseline and for what today's storage formats look like, and balancing the resolution of that data as well as what's actually on that SD card. So again, thinking about things like optimal data formats for storage. So things like Esri i3s or Cesium 3D tiles, as well as supplemental data that might be beneficial to pack in there as well. Things like bathymetry when you're looking at water, and certain specific imagery rasters in relation to like land use, land cover. So there is today currently that sort of global scale capability that can fit on an SD card, but there's still a good bit of research going into what is that optimal balance of what is actually needed at the point of need, especially if no new data is going to come, and what is needed if the goal would be rapidly updating that data based on new changes when you get to the point of need.
Thank you. Yeah, that was my follow-up question, was how often that information gets updated and refreshed.
Yep. So the idea there is right now not too often, because it really is a scale problem of the hardware and software accessibility, right? But the ideal would be that in the future, in sort of the perfect world where the hardware and software piece is very cost effective, requires no training, and can kind of simply be shipped out to any non-expert to be able to collect new data, that would happen very frequently, right? So today it's more of a planned operation where you've got to ensure that the people who are going to be updating that data have the proper training to do it, and that sort of thing. But back to that idea of increasing the automation across all of these processes, that's a key part of it, is not just increasing the automation of the data creation part, but also of the collection part, so that no one actually needs any specific training to be able to do those collections, to do the updates.
Excellent, thank you.
Got a question from Josh Whitaker.
Is in the chat. I'm looking now. Sorry. Let's see.
Yeah, it's in the chat. So I'll read the question. I'm a technical artist and AR/VR consultant. I wanted to know if there is any AR or VR support currently and what hardware is supported. I know you mentioned that we're planning on making this more open source. Do you have a timeline as to when that may in fact take place?
Sure, definitely, and great question. So the RIDE platform, which we're using to sort of build out that foundational tool set, as well as be the consumer of all of this data, is built on Unity, the game engine Unity. The RIDE platform is agnostic, so it can be ported to other game engines in a relatively straightforward process. But through using Unity, that's one of our goals, is ensuring that multi-target support for the RIDE platform exists out of the box. So currently, RIDE supports HTC Vive, HoloLens 1, HoloLens 2, without any modifications. It should be really easy to also target that to additional AR and VR devices. Those are just the only ones that we've targeted so far. And the timeline for being able to bring that into a more open source capability, we're hoping to have that done in sort of the next iteration, probably within the next 2 months. So we're really pushing to get that done quick, because the more people we can get involved in working sort of collaboratively in this platform, the better it is to actually, get all these additional capabilities in that can be shared across that community of users. Yep, yes, I see in the chat. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Any further questions? We have probably time for one more, maybe two more questions before we have to wrap.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Nigel. I'm a Master of Architecture candidate in the School of Architecture. My question is, do you see the possibility that such technology could be used to tackle some urban issue, such as maybe a homeless issue in LA, or like urban architectural problems? Thank you.
Sure. So I'd say the answer is 100% yes. I think, we're looking at sort of, again, the foundational pieces to tackle that in some really unique ways. So one of the things that we're actually looking at doing, because if you want to start to tackle issues like that, the more realistic and higher fidelity your simulation model, the better your solution is going to be when you're actually attempting to model the fix for those issues. And so we're looking at some really unique things using the USC campus as sort of the ultimate in terrain realism, as far as like the digital twin idea, where we, since we have such great access to the campus, data sets of the campus, data sources from the campus, building that out in such a level that from the interior of a building to knowing like what screws were used to like fasten the facade to the building infrastructure, to what the campus looks like overall, having that micro to macro view of a section, I believe will be one of those requirements for accurately modeling and being able to come up with solutions to things like the homeless problem. Like the more information that you have about an area, the better. And so by tying in all of those things that are specific to the terrain, as well as then overlaying information from non-terrain sources that are going to give you that information, related to population and building density and traffic and all of these other infrastructure issues, all of that can live within, some of it can live within the data itself. And then some of that can live within the tools. So, I'd say absolutely. And that is something that I would love to see built in as some of those foundational capabilities, is sort of learning what would be the approach to best tackle that problem, and then building the tools foundationally to support the solution to that problem, so that then other people can make use of those tools in unique ways, or even to help collaborate on solving problems like that. Because that's something I would love to see this data begin to tackle. Thank you.
So I'll add to that, briefly. Most of what you probably picked up on in this presentation is most of the current collection is being done through exterior to building or exterior surfaces. The bridge forward is going to be, how do we then take that and look interior? So, most of the world, as I think most folks recognize, is an outdoor place. But what we do recognize is many parts of the world is an indoor place, where people live more indoors than outdoors. And so how do we collect that data, and how do we then take that data, ingest it into these gaming engines, are big ideas. There's already, as you probably well recognize, many sensors that are already inside of buildings, whether we're talking about security cameras or maybe even your own iPhone as you collect interiors. How do we then take that information and bring it into this game space, this modeling simulation space, through the use of those sensors and then other sensors that are going to be developed? Big question, but certainly an important question to tackle that question that was just asked by Niels. Any further questions? I think we have time for one more and then we're going to break.
One more question here. Jonathan Romero, Applied Research Associates.
Yep.
Thank you very much for the presentation. One thing that I think is of interest of a lot of people using these sorts of platforms is having access to data to test with. And while this sort of real world data is of incredible importance, I was wondering if perhaps you had considered using synthetically generated data or procedurally generated data to minimize the initial barrier to entry to transferring large data sets to test some of these tools.
Jonathan, yeah, thank you. Wonderful question. So part of this that I didn't really touch on is that we are building out a synthetic data generation pipeline. We're using it internally to train the Staples Plus data model, but we're also working on using it to generate hyper-realistic real-world models that can solve that exact problem. I think in this whole arena, one of the biggest issues that we have is collecting real-world data, ensuring that we have the rights to share that real-world data, and then doing meaningful things with that real-world data. Those are two of the biggest problems. So the synthetic data generation side is one of the ways that we're looking to tackle that, so that we can actually share data sets, an infinite amount of data sets theoretically that sort of meet all of these objectives and give people access to data that they need to build out these tools. And then on that same note, we have a separate initiative where we're currently working to collect real world data that is openly shareable. So we're trying to build up a database of the synthetic data, as well as the tools that people can use to generate requirements of the synthetic data that they might have. So they sort of have access to that generation tool set and platform themselves, but also actually building up a larger repository of data that has no distribution restrictions, that can be very open sourced and openly shared as well. So looking at two ways of tackling the data problem, because thanks for bringing it up, because that is a huge issue.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it sounds like you've got that whole angle covered.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's going to be it for the day. We appreciate, again, everyone's attendance. There have been a few administrative questions asked. The first question was, is this going to be a recorded event that folks can tap back into? The answer is yes. For those that had requested attendance, you should get notification that it's in a YouTube video for viewing at a later date. Regarding the slides, I'll work with Kyle and Jason and see what we can do about providing the slides to those that were in attendance as well, and then provide feedback on that response. Again, thanks for everyone's attendance today. If you've got further questions to anyone on the discussion today, please look to find us at the email addresses provided, and we'll get back to you about answers to your questions that you may have. Again, thanks for your attendance. Appreciate everyone being part of today's session. Fight on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much.